I hope you can see the next slide, and I didn't have a problem like last time. What was the outcome of the workshop in brief? Was some firm action plan of the 8 case studies, including the list of requirements related to climate data, what kind of post-processing is it, how to tailor the products for the service delivery. We had discussion and we try to understand what are the commonalities among all the 4 sectors that we are working on, and how to create synergies within the case studies and sectors. Then we were exposed to what is the responsible research and innovation, which is a little bit also it was a very nice way of approach the value chain, and who we are including in this value chain, and how we want to progress in the inclusiveness of our climate services. And through this discussion, we also we developed a checklist and some indicators of how to measure our progress with the responsible research and innovation. And also we looked at some challenges that we are facing, and we identified them, and had a discussion on how to tackle them. So, and this, thank you, Raul. I borrowed this from his presentation. We are in the first phase of, say, the development of the climate services, and we are looking at the science, at the context of the geographical context and climate context, where we are going to develop our climate services. So we start from the science. We explore what kind of data we need for the climate services, and also we start to explore what kind of method that we are going to apply for delivering the products. How to combine the data, how the information should be provided for the development of climate services, and we explored, let's say, these kind of requirements for the 8 case studies. So just to say that the 8 case studies, they comprise each case studies. We had a team which comprise of service providers, users first, to have their perspective, the service provider, and the research institution. So each case study is going to work in a team of these 3 elements together. And this is how this is going to work. And again, I thank Raul for giving me the permission to use one of his slides that he produced. And we want to work taking into consideration the responsible research and innovation approach. This approach to the theory and also some activity around this approach. And the approach took us through and tried to understand who are the actors, what is the key issues that we want to include in our process of developing climate services, and what are the process dimension that we want to implement. And so this is a schematic of these 3, say, elements. The actors that which we try to identify belongs to the category of the research community, the civil society and the organization, the business and industry, the education community, and the policymakers. And the key issue that we also will include in our thinking, in our process, is ethic, gender equality, governance, open access, public engagement, and science education. And this is the core, say, issues and actors, and the way that we are working, which is the process dimension, is through the diverse and inclusiveness, open and transparency, anticipative and reflective and responsive and adaptive. So this was, say, the exposure and that we had on the research, and how we translated this in our work was one of the activity that we had during the workshop. So we have, I have a colleague, Trevor from CSIR, going to discuss this. I just have my last slides before I give the floor to him, and say that we had activity on breakout groups in the 2 days. So the first day we had a discussion on the case studies, and we had 5 breakout groups looking at food security, energy, water, and infrastructure. And the second day we have 3 groups grouped like agriculture, food security, water, infrastructure, and energy. And we discuss about the responsible research and innovation. I give the floor now to Trevor to deep dive more into what really was the outcome of the workshop that we had, and some of the initial thought on the research, on the responsible research and innovation. Over to you, Trevor, and I'm going to change the slides for you.
Thank you, Roberta. And so I'm going to just talk about the outcomes of the case study 1 in this project, which is focused on food security in South Africa. And there are, of course, other case studies in other countries. So I was involved in the South Africa case study, and in the first day of the internal workshop, we basically came out with a tentative work plan for the project. So we began that by clarifying the objectives of the case study, and these are basically to assess the impact of climate change on food security in a key maize producing region of the country, which is the Northwest Province. We also aim to understand the needs of the land bank and its clients for climate change information to manage the associated financial risks. And then we also aim to develop a climate product that informs the land bank of its exposure to climate-related risks to facilitate adjusting its credit model. And we heard from Neru this morning how they are being encouraged and required to broaden the scope of their existing risk assessments, to go beyond the sort of traditional risks and to look more at the climate and environmental risks. In terms of characterizing the end user's profile and requirements, and I know we've spoken a lot about end users and the terminology, but officially in this project the end user is the land bank. And so we learned that there is two main sort of decisions that are climate related that the bank has to sort of engage with. And the first is mortgages for farm purchases, which is a longer term decision typically over 20 years. And then they also have decisions that they make around loans for seasonal input costs. So that is the main sort of credit lending that they're involved in. And this lending is direct to farmers and also through co-ops. And Neeru was obviously part of this discussion, and he stressed the need for us to consider current and potential future clients. And as we heard, their emphasis is going to be more and more on small-scale farmers. So that is where we need to try and cover in terms of our consultations in the project. If you could go to the next slide. So the next step in the work plan was making an inventory of the data and modeling needs. And in the project, we will be modeling crop production using the DSAT model. And this model requires information on the study area, baseline and future climate, soils, typical cropping practices, and then we also need some observed yields and production info to ensure that the model is performing adequately. We'll also look at producing some climate crop indices like heat units or drought indices to also inform the risk assessment for the credit model. And also, as well as crop production, we'll also look at livestock rather simplistically at this stage in terms of a basic livestock stress index, which is just purely based on climate info to account for livestock production. And then we will also need to develop ways of engaging with the stakeholders through, for example, surveys, focus group discussions, etc. Because it's not just the land bank that we need to sort of engage with, but also their clients, and understanding what their risks are and what drives their behavior, and to sort of promote climate smart agriculture practices. So the forecast products that we will produce will be projected changes in crop yields, crop climate indices, and a livestock stress index. And then these will be incorporated into the land bank's credit model. That is kind of the area where we expect some capacity development to be needed. How do we go about doing that? What are the important, how do we quantify the risks, etc. And then we developed a tentative timeline, and this stretches over the next 4 years. And finally, from day one, we sort of identified the expected challenges. And stakeholder engagement is probably the tricky one there, especially if we're going to be talking to small-scale farmers. The COVID situation has made this a difficult proposition at this stage. So we need to sort of come up with ways of dealing with that. So then moving on to day 2, where we looked at how we frame this case study through the lens of the responsible research and innovation approach. And the way we did this was to have this online mural, which has sort of virtual post-it notes that you stick onto the mural, and you build up a picture for how you implement this RRI approach. And there's sort of four main, well, a number of main steps that you work through. The first step, I don't expect you will be able to make out much on the slide, but it just gives you an overall view of what the mural looked like, and I'll show some close-ups. This one involves the system mapping. That's one of the steps in the RRI approach, where we have this graph of sustainability, resilience, and efficiency. And there's a curve there which is kind of covered up by all the post-it notes, but it's that blue line there. And there's a sweet spot in the middle there where you are in the right zone as far as resilience, efficiency, and sustainability. And the post-it notes are kind of randomly placed at this stage, so their progression in time isn't really reflected yet. And this is definitely a preliminary work. So the items ringed in red are more relevant to this case study because all of the agriculture and food security case studies were lumped together. So there was four different countries represented here, and the items in red are more relevant to the South Africa case study. And the square blocks are the sort of participants, like the CSIR being ourselves, the land bank, and the farmers associations. The green circles represent enablers. For example, networking, mapping of user needs, and then the red circle, the solid circle is the barriers, and those would be things like knowledge gaps, lack of resources, not necessarily in the project funding, but in the implementation of the work beyond the project. Then the diagram on the right represents the shared vision for case study 1, which we came up with, and that is, you probably can't read that, but it was robust credit decision making in the face of climate risks and greater application of climate smart production methods in the agricultural sector. So that's kind of the overall vision for case study 1 that we defined. We go into the next slide. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I am in the next slide. Correct?
Okay, for me it's still frozen, but I do have a printout here, so I'll try and talk to that. Okay, there we go. So in this slide, the focus is on what are the ingredients or actions that are needed to achieve that vision that we defined. And there's the framework of the RRI approach, which considers ethics, gender equality, governance, open access, public engagement, science education. And so in defining these ingredients and actions, we bear those sort of pillars in mind. And again, all the post-it notes that are ringed are more specific to case study 1 or more relevant to case study 1. So we had things like we need to ensure that the products we develop are sort of maintained and used after the project. We need to make sure that we incorporate climate risks into the credit model in a systematic way, that we develop mutual understanding between the lenders and the borrowers of the climate risks that are involved. We need to quantify the benefits of the work at the end of the day, and make sure that the climate services are meeting the user's needs. So those are just some of the aspects that we, or some of the actions that we identified. Can we go to the next slide, please? And in this slide was about looking at answering the question of how will we know whether we've succeeded? What are the indicators that we're going to look at? And here the some of the indicators, we sort of categorize them into qualitative and quantitative. And for qualitative, we looked at things like mutual and shared knowledge built, which will be very important, gender equality, and there's probably others. As I say, this is preliminary work, and we need to delve more into this during the project. In terms of quantitative indicators, we had suggestions of developing a production resilience indicator to see whether these actions that are taken result in more resilient production. We'd like to see reduced bank losses and farmer bankruptcies. And another indicator that we identified for the South African case study was evidence of best practice and positive impact. And obviously those things need to be fleshed out a bit more, and to actually find ways of being able to quantify those things. So I think that pretty much summarizes the second day, which was to frame the work in terms of the RRI approach. Yeah, so that's all from me. Thank you.